In the action genre, few properties are as revered or well respected as Die Hard. With the franchise reaching its 35th anniversary last year, and Bruce Willis now retired from acting, it's time to look back at the 5 films, examining all the ups and downs and how they entertained audiences through the decades. Let's get started. Die Hard, the breakout hit. In the late 1980s, action films were ruling the cinema. Some were serious, others were ludicrous, embracing their over-the-top style without any trouble. But then in 1988, along came a film called Die Hard, which bucked the trend and propelled Bruce Willis to superstardom. Inspired by the likes of No One Lives Forever and The Towering Inferno, the franchise debut was directed by John McTiernan. Fresh off of Predator from the previous year, he delivered a landmark title that set the standard for all the action movies to follow. The premise was simple, but laced with a great deal of gritty realism. John McClane is a police officer who journeys to the Nakatomi Tower in Los Angeles to reconnect with his estranged wife Holly, played by Bonnie Bedelia, at a work party. Unfortunately for them and the other guests, the building is targeted by a band of well-armed thieves who want to rob the place. Slipping away unnoticed and without any shoes, John has nothing but a few bullets and his own ingenuity to rescue the hostages and get help from the outside. All the while, the police forces who do respond are mind-numbingly incompetent, placing even more pressure on our leading man to save the day. John immediately stood out as a relatable everyman character with real flaws and real personal problems. Between being afraid of flying and having a real argument with Holly in the first act, audiences quickly latched onto his character. Sure, having a power fantasy was always entertaining, but bringing things down to earth as the first Die Hard did was a major cornerstone of the writing. The professional thieves are led by one of the very best villains in both the 80s and the action genre. Alan Rickman made his big screen debuts in Die Hard, and the impression he left was beyond impressive. Hans Gruber is a conniving yet professional mastermind, always being deeply measured in both his words and actions. The moment where he interacts with John face to face is perhaps the best scene in the entire series, teasing out their differences and keeping the audience guessing. What's interesting is how he starts to crack a little at the end, losing his temper when Holly berates him and quickly moving to blow the roof when he realises John is up there. Many reviewers have pointed this out already, but Die Hard's secret ingredient was the vulnerability of its leading man. At the time of its release, action heroes like John Rambo, John Matrix from Commando, and Chuck Norris were near unstoppable juggernauts who mowed down hundreds of foes without breaking a sweat. John McClane, on the other hand, is caught in a desperate situation, but he's the only one willing to push on and overcome the odds. This is especially true for the rugged fight scene with Carl, which makes the deliberate choice not to rely on choreography. It's just pure rage as John pummels the villain and struggles to come out on top. These creative choices worked wonders for the film's tension, which bestowed audiences with many memorable scenes. John crawls through the vents and just barely avoids being filled with bullets, and in the film's best action sequence, trades fire as the glass shatters and leaves him vulnerable. Yet the film also takes the time to slow down and allow John's human side to emerge. Towards the end of the flick, we have one scene that isn't present in any of the sequels. John is hurting bad, both physically and mentally, and doesn't think he'll make it through the ordeal. Many of us will have gone through similar moments. Willis does a fantastic job conveying the stress, pain, and downcast emotions as McClane leans on Al Powell, his only avenue of support, to pull himself together. By the end, John is just about hanging on both figuratively and literally, with the final confrontation being simple yet effective. Our hero uses his 2 bullets wisely and saves Holly from falling in the nick of time, maintaining the film's razor-sharp tension to the last moment. As a film, Die Hard stands on its own. John, Holly, and the remaining hostages make it out alive, and all the villains are dead. But the franchise would grow and expand a great deal in the decades to come. Audiences didn't have to wait long for a follow-up. Die Hard 2 Die Harder, the over-the-top sequel. With the huge success of Die Hard, a sequel was quickly put into production. With John McTiernan busy with the hunt for Red October, Finnish director Renny Harlin stepped up to the plate in 1990. Taking place at Washington Airport, Die Hard 2 Die Harder is a straightforward sequel, taking the same premise and scaling up the size and stakes. Here's a fun fact: according to a video breakdown from Screen Junkies, Die Hard 2 is the only film McClane would actually survive in real life, sustaining heavy but non-fatal injuries. This time around, a group of terrorists hacks into the airport runway system, forcing multiple planes to circle the outer markers while running low on fuel. Die Hard 2 wastes no time getting started as John investigates suspicious activity from the disgraced Colonel Stewart and his men. As John and the airport managers desperately try to get a hold of the situation, the sinister deeds eventually culminate in the villains crashing a plane and killing everyone on board. It's definitely the darkest moment of the franchise, one that shows how dangerous the villains are. John, sitting in the airport office with a despondent look on his face, continues the same relatable characterization of the first film. With that said, his character doesn't progress too far from the original. Holly also returns, but she's confined to sitting on a plane and later knocking out the slimy reporter Dick Thornburg as she did before. On the topic of darker moments, one element that rubbed some viewers the wrong way was the endless anger. Most of the characters, including McClane himself, are endlessly arguing and getting under each other's skin, especially Carmine Lorenzo, who does nothing but moan for most of the picture. The notable exception is Leslie Barnes, who is the only side character with a good-natured streak. On the one hand, it shows how desperate the situation becomes, but on the other, it does take away from the charisma of the first film. The villains also leave a lot to be desired. For starters, there are 3 of them, which makes it difficult for any to match Hans Gruber. We start off with Colonel Stewart, who seems to be the main villain of the piece, but then halfway through we're introduced to the dictator Raymond Esperanza, who doesn't have much to do other than get into a brief firefight with John and talk with the other villains. Finally, Major Grant and a good portion of his men are revealed to be traitors after they arrive at the airport to contain the problem. The shock twist works well enough, but at this point the film is heading into the climax, and Grant doesn't have enough depth or material to measure up. The performances all work well, but the antagonists don't come close to the original film. For these reasons, Die Hard 2 isn't as good as the first, but it's still wildly entertaining. The action may not be as tense, but it still boasts some violent freewheeling carnage. The first big sequence sees John take down a unit of soldiers single-handedly to rescue Leslie Barnes. By placing the troops in different parts of the environment, the action still stands out when compared to other genre sequels from the early 90s. It also has the highest body count and nastiest deaths of the series, with one soldier taking an icicle to the eye and Major Grant getting sucked into the jet engine by the end. One of the film's biggest highlights is when John narrowly escapes a plane cockpit using an ejector seat. It's a very ambitious sequence for the time and always hits the mark. Finally, the conclusion is definitely the most insane of the entire franchise. Panic breaks out at the airport, and watching John take out the entire enemy platoon with one explosion and his trademark catchphrase is always so satisfying to watch. Die Hard and Die Hard 2 work great as a double feature for the festive season. Both films are set at Christmas, and both of them end with Let It Snow from Julie Stein and Sammy Cahn. Rennie Harlin would take a lot of inspiration from the Die Hard franchise for his next flick, Cliffhanger, one of the most widely enjoyed releases of the early 90s. It would take 5 years for the next Die Hard film to be released, and fans were in for another solid thrill ride. Die Hard with a Vengeance, The Return to Form. Arriving right in the middle of the 90s, the third Die Hard took us to the protagonist's stomping ground in New York. As the title implies, it connects with the original film, and you could ignore Die Hard 2 and jump straight to this one. John McTiernan was back in the directing chair, and he delivered what many consider the best sequel of the franchise, a film potentially on par with the original. To start, we have a great team-up between Bruce Willis and Samuel L. Jackson, but the production goes much further than that. When a series of bombs are planted across the city by a manipulative schemer, John, with his unwilling partner Zeus in tow, are forced to complete a series of guessing games across the city as they attempt to keep their fellow New Yorkers safe. What you notice about Die Hard 3 is how it acts as an inverse of the first film. Instead of one building, John is racing across all of New York City. Rather than building strong camaraderie with a fellow police officer, John is stuck with someone he doesn't really like, but the two have to work together to catch the perpetrators. Instead of being snowed in at Christmas, Die Hard 3 takes place in a hot and stressful summer. In other ways, the series progresses forward, and this shows mainly through the side characters. John's comrades in the NYPD are smart, competent, and effective, even if they do have some resentment for the washed-up protagonist. Sure, they may be stuck in a tricky situation, but they keep pushing to find and protect the population from start to finish, especially when the Chester A. Arthur School is threatened. It's as if McTiernan took all the criticisms of the original film on board and made the best improvements. Standing in opposition, we have the second best antagonist in the series, Jeremy Irons, having just performed in The Lion King in 1994, was an excellent choice for Simon Gruber. He's such a devious villain, but also has the strategic know-how to rob an entire city thanks to his military experience. His scheme is so well planned that the FBI actually investigated the filmmakers in real life, calculating that it would actually succeed if they didn't update their security protocols. Simon's scenes are often marked by a military march, a key piece of the soundtrack that shows his platoon is well equipped and well organised. They put John and Zeus through a ton of physical abuse as the film goes on. On top of all these changes, the film also boasts the same balance of action, suspense and comic relief. Die Hard 3 has something that every other entry doesn't, a driving momentum that never slows down from the moment John and Zeus flee Harlem. Some movies make use of sexual tension, but Die Hard 3 uses racial tension. This element is mostly played for laughs, as John and Zeus trade insults and banter back and forth throughout the film. These moments enter and exit the scene without becoming too overbearing, and in keeping with the film's tone, aren't meant to be taken too seriously. It's another piece of the script that makes their dynamics so entertaining. The film is constantly throwing in new scenarios that keep the tension flowing. The narrow escape from the subway bombing is a well-staged sequence, and watching the two leads hold on for dear life as they zipline down to the tanker ship is a real nail-biter. These moments push the envelope just far enough without going too over the top, placing this sequel above the previous film. Die Hard with a Vengeance comes pretty close to the first for me, but there's only one scene that doesn't work too well. It's the final confrontation, which feels very rushed and a bit laughable. McClane simply shoots a cable and the villains end up doing themselves in by crashing the helicopter. I give the sequence credits for John making the most of limited resources, but there needed to be a more intense final showdown between him and Simon. An alternative ending was filmed where Simon actually succeeded in his escape and ruined McClane's life in the process, with the two having a very tense chat. It's an interesting idea, one that mirrors the face-to-face confrontation with Hans in the original. Even with this muted conclusion, Die Hard with a Vengeance is still a brilliant action film. Some viewers even choose it as their favourite. The franchise could have ended there, but it would once again return after a long hiatus. Die Hard 4, the controversial modern return. After Die Hard with a Vengeance, ideas for a fourth film were floating around at 20th Century Fox for some time. Following a 12-year wait, Live Free or Die Hard, better known as Die Hard 4.0, arrived. A lot had changed between 1995 and 2007, which caused Len Wiseman to take things in a different direction. The old-fashioned cop would go up against the dangers of cybercriminals taken to a grand scale across a large portion of America. Much like its predecessor, the fourth entry is a summer blockbuster, taking place on the 4th of July and carrying all the bombastic elements that made the franchise so popular. In many ways, Die Hard 4 returns to the over-the-top style of number 2, but it bolts on a more modern premise of criminals taking a virtual sledgehammer to America's connected infrastructure. It's a solid choice, planting an older John McClane into a world very keen to push him aside. In this film, Bruce still portrays him with a great deal of sarcasm. He's seen all of this crap before, but still likes to mess around with the bad guys before taking them down. This main theme is matched by his daughter Lucy, who also wants little to do with him as the film opens, but eventually a tougher side emerges, which is channeled well by Mary Elizabeth Winstead. John is forced to rely on his own skills in a different way, teaming up with Justin Long's Matthew to hack into the enemy networks. In this way, the action alternates between internal and external threats, bringing on another round of intense sequences. One moment sees John and Matthew go up against Maggie Q's Lynn, and the next the duo are trying to track down her superior using a fellow hacker's equipment. The pacing rises and falls to a good standard, while emphasising the wider threat. Most of the surrounding characters are quite basic, with Cliff Curtis as Miguel Bowman, often showing up late after McClane has done all the work. On the other hand, Die Hard 4 boasts arguably the coldest villain of the series. Thomas Gabriel isn't physically imposing, but he has next to no conscience and doesn't care who gets hurt in the slightest. Timothy Olyphant is a really underrated actor, and he does a solid job throughout the film. Between deleting John's savings account in an instant, gunning down members of his own crew, and roughing up both Lucy and Matthew in the third act, his technical skills are placed front and centre. With a higher budget and modern techniques, the fourth Die Hard is certainly the most destructive title in the series. The early helicopter chase, followed up by traffic lanes crashing into each other, really pulls you into the action, and the gigantic gas explosion, followed by a full blackout, shows the lengths the villains will go to take John out. At the time of its release, many fans turned their noses up at Die Hard 4 for its PG-13 rating. Most of the swearing was removed and the violence was toned down. This section of the fanbase was somewhat placated when the unrated edition was released on DVD and Blu-ray. To me, Die Hard 4 still works really well. Even with the adult elements being cut out, the fight scenes still pack a punch. John shoots one foe in the foot to gain the upper hand, another takes a tumble down an elevator shaft, and the fast-moving showdown with the parkour expert Rand are all very well-made sequences. The craziest scene of all pits John against a fighter jet with false orders to take him out. It does tip the scales of realism, but just like Die Hard 2 before it, watching the protagonist narrowly survive an insanely powerful military machine is a ton of fun to watch. Most of the action is still done in camera with a limited use of computer effects. The film is also known for its many injuries during filming, with between 200 and 250 stunt people being used in the production. Die Hard 4 aimed to close the loop with the final encounter, a close shootout similar to the first film. It's a gnarly moment when John shoots himself through the shoulder to take out Gabriel, while Matthew finally pulls through to finish off the last henchman. The fourth entry may not be widely enjoyed by everyone, but it proved that the franchise still had what it took to entertain audiences in the 21st century. The fifth entry would change things again, this time for the worst. A Good Day to Die Hard, the utter disaster. 6 years after Die Hard 4, the series returned for one more outing. Widely regarded as the absolute worst, A Good Day to Die Hard was a travesty, a disgrace to not only its franchise, but also the wider genre. In 2013, it was symptomatic of a difficult time for action cinema, an era where cookie-cutter plots, lazy characterization, and choppy editing all combined to deliver many throwaway productions. It was directed by John Moore, who at the time was best known for the film adaptation of Max Payne. Already, things were off to a bad start. The plot, if you can call it that, sees John McClane journey to Russia to find his son Jack, who works for the CIA. Jack, played by Jai Courtney in his first major role, is investigating some kind of corrupt trial and a secret file that really doesn't matter in the slightest. As soon as John arrives in the country, any semblance of story is tossed out the window, and the film cares so little about every character. This is plainly obvious with Jack's CIA team being killed off just a few minutes after we meet them. By far the most egregious sin the film commits is John himself. He used to be a flawed man, but one who still wanted to do the right thing and keep innocent people out of harm's way. Now he beats a man up, steals his car, and proceeds to drive over countless drivers. His likeable charisma is nowhere to be found. Instead, the writers chose to have him say, "I'm on vacation," over and over again, and in other cases rip off lines from previous films. As the movie goes on, you quickly realise that none of the key components from previous films are present. There are no fight scenes where McClane survives by the skin of his teeth, and many of the action scenes are terribly shot, shifting far away from the gritty realism of previous entries. The truck chase through Moscow is atrocious, with all its crash zooms and poor continuity. For the most part, we have no idea where the key players are in this jumbled mess, and there is no sense of tension whatsoever. Then we have this ridiculous moment where John and Jack leap out a window, crash down 10 stories while avoiding a Russian gunship. This is the kind of hollow junk you'd expect to see in a throwaway action flick, not a Die Hard sequel. Like everything else in the movie, the villains are truly awful. A Good Day to Die Hard tries to imitate Die Hard 2, starting with one main villain who takes up most of the runtime before bringing in a new one. The difference here is that both are poorly done in both performance and depth. Alec, played by Radivoj Bukvich, spends most of his time commenting on how annoyed he is about John's interference, tap dances while eating a carrot, and is suddenly killed off by the second villain. Taking the man the McClanes have been protecting and making him the real villain is bad enough, but Yuri Komarov is such a hollow and pointless character that much of the wider scheming around nukes and weapons is utterly wasted. The film even rips off the same shot of Gruber falling when Yuri is thrown to his death in the climax, showing that Die Hard 5 has nothing to offer. As I mentioned in one of my first reviews over 10 years ago, A Good Day to Die Hard is simply not a Die Hard movie in any way, shape or form. The only positive thing I can say about it is that it's mercifully short at just under an hour and a half. A crappy release becomes slightly more bearable if it doesn't drag on and outstay its welcome. The fifth Die Hard was quickly forgotten, and nowadays many of the popular movie reaction channels on YouTube avoid it completely. With a crappy CGI-fueled helicopter explosion and a cliched ending of John, Lucy and Jack walking off into the sunset, the series reached an unceremonious close, and no more films were ever produced. Bruce Willis would retire from acting in 2022 due to serious health complications from aphasia. So there you have it, the Die Hard series ran from 1988 to 2013, maintaining a mostly positive reputation along the way. The franchise may now be finished, but it still holds sway in the action genre, and for good reason. The first film marked a major milestone, the following 3 sequels delivered enjoyable outings, and while the 5th entry ended with a whimper, it didn't tarnish the overall legacy of the series. The first 4 films remain very watchable to this day, with the best option being the quadrilogy box set on Blu-ray. Only one thing left to say, take it away, Bruce.
Yippee-ki-yay, motherfucker.
Thanks for watching. Going back through the Die Hard series was an entertaining ride, but which film was your favourite? Let me know in the comments below. You can find other franchise retrospectives like this one on my blog and channel.